Hello peoples, Ollie here again from Reflections Aquatics, and today I thought I'd talk about nitrate and phosphate in a reef tank. Now when it comes to the water chemistry in a reef tank, I like to think of it simply as a bunch of things accumulating and depleting, meaning that we need to find ways to reduce things that are accumulating up to undesirable levels, and on the flip side, find ways of buffing things that have been utilised by our corals and depleting down to unacceptable levels. When it comes to accumulates, nitrate and phosphate are probably the two main compounds that you're going to want to keep an eye on. As to elements and compounds that are depleting in your system, well, there are many, such as calcium, magnesium, sodium carbonate, potassium, etc., but that's probably another discussion. For now, we'll focus on the stars of the show, nitrate and phosphate. Now, if you watched our previous video on the nitrogen cycle, you'll understand how nitrate accumulates in our systems. To put it simply, nitrate is basically the end product of all of the biologically processed waste within our tanks. Phosphate, on the other hand, generally comes in through the addition of food. All living organisms have phosphate in their cells, but in an established reef tank, it's generally the addition of food, be it fish food or coral food, that's going to bring in the most phosphate. It's also worth noting that phosphate can be found bound up in secondhand live rock, base rock, and even some brands of synthetic rock. If you were to set up a new aquarium and grab a bunch of secondhand rock from a tank with high phosphate levels, you can expect some of that phosphate to carry over into your tank. I've seen plenty of cases of reefers setting up tanks with secondhand base rock, etc., and finding themselves having to deal with high concentrations of phosphate. Now, there are ways of removing high concentrations of phosphate from such rock, and one of the safer ways of doing this is to bathe the rock in a solution of bleach and water for a week or so. Now, obviously you have to be careful handling large quantities of bleach. Bulk Reef Supply in the States have done a handy video on how to cure such rock and how to do it safely. So if you're looking at going down that path, definitely check out that video. Okay, so now that we understand how nitrate and phosphate are making their way into our systems, how do we keep them at acceptable levels? And what are acceptable levels? I'll start by saying that both nitrate and phosphate are essential nutrients to coral, and stripping them out completely is detrimental, but in the wild they're found in very low concentrations. Concentrations in the ocean will vary depending on depth, but over shallow water reefs, phosphate is generally down at around 0.005 parts per million. Nitrate concentrations are higher, but still rarely exceed about 0.1 parts per million. So traditionally we've tried to keep our nitrate and phosphate levels as close to these natural concentrations as possible. However, it can be tricky to keep them that low without stripping them out completely. Certain types of corals can tolerate higher levels of nitrate and phosphate than other types of coral. Generally, leather corals and LPS corals, long polyp stony corals, can tolerate a bit more nitrate and phosphate than, say, SPS corals, short polyp stony corals. To give you an example, in our SPS display tank here, I try to keep my phosphates under about 0.05 parts per million and my nitrates under about 2 parts per million. Now those levels are still significantly higher than what you'd find on a natural reef, but they're not that high that they're going to bother the corals, and they're not that low that they're going to be hard from stripping out completely. In our leather display, which you see behind me, I have a bit more leeway, and I quite often let the nitrate and the phosphate get quite high in this system. Now, it's always good practice to try to keep the nitrate and the phosphate as low as possible. However, leather and LPS tanks are definitely more forgiving. Interestingly, over the last few years, we've started to see some SPS tanks surface running what we refer to as high nutrient levels, meaning high concentrations of nitrate and phosphate. Now, the one that probably comes to mind the most will be Sanjay Joshi's SPS tank in the States, where he's running a whopping 50 parts per million nitrate and 0.4 parts per million phosphate, and still experiencing excellent growth and colour within his SPS corals. Now, there are variables that come into play when trying to get SPS corals to tolerate such high concentrations of nitrate and phosphate, and that's probably another discussion down the track. So for most reefers, I'd recommend trying to keep your nitrate and phosphate levels as close as you can to natural concentrations. Simulating nature is always a safe place to start. Rightio, so I want to talk about algae quickly. Now, algae is a raw pain in the butt to many reefers, and algae's favourite source of food is nitrate and phosphate. Therefore, high nutrient tanks tend to get a lot of algae growth. Even low nutrient systems can still experience aggressive and problematic types of algae growth. But keeping your nitrate and phosphate levels as low as possible will definitely help to hinder certain strains of algae from popping up, of which there are thousands of different types. Algae probably deserves its own discussion though, so we'll make a separate video on that further down the track. So, how do we remove nitrate and phosphate from our systems? Well, there are various ways. Back in the day, one popular form of nitrate and phosphate removal was from what we refer to as a deep sand bed. Now, a deep sand bed is a 6 or 7 inch deep layer of sand used as a substrate, in which the bottom few inches of that sand bed will become anaerobic and anoxic, meaning that they're getting stripped of oxygen. In these zones, anaerobic bacteria will start to colonise that feeds on and removes nitrate and phosphate. Now, deep sand beds actually did a great job at removing nitrate and phosphate, but they came with an element of risk. Within these anaerobic and anoxic zones, some nasty substances would also build up, the main one of concern to reefers being hydrogen sulfide, which is extremely toxic to fish and coral. Now, if undisturbed, these anaerobic and anoxic zones pose no problems. However, if the deep sand bed was turned over by a tank inhabitant or maybe some shifting and falling live rock, it could release some of that hydrogen sulfide into the water column, leading to major issues and, worst case scenario, crash the tank. Nitrate and sulfur reactors also came onto the market 10 or so years ago, which work in a similar fashion. Within these reactors, they build up anaerobic zones which can feed on and remove nitrate and phosphate. They also worked well. However, I find them to be a little bit finicky. The outflow hose quite often clogs up and they kind of need a lot of attention to keep them running smoothly. These days, one of the safer ways to utilise the benefits of anaerobic bacteria is to use biological filter media that has the capacity to develop anaerobic and anoxic zones within its inner core. There are various brands on the market. At the moment, probably one of the more popular ones with reefers is called Saporax by Serra. So anyway, that covers anaerobic bacteria as a form of reducing nitrate and phosphate. Over the last 5 or so years, what we refer to as carbon dosing has also become a popular way of dealing with nitrates and phosphates. Carbon dosing works by introducing organic carbon into the system, which fuels a free-floating aerobic bacteria that feeds on nitrate and phosphate. The bacteria is then pulled out of the water column through the use of a protein skimmer. Organic carbon can be introduced into the system in various ways. Originally, people were using vodka or vinegar or combinations of both to introduce organic carbon. Over the years, companies have developed more refined solutions, the most popular probably being Nopox by Red Sea. Biopellets also hit the market not long after, and biopellets are small pellets that release organic carbon. They need to be tumbled in a reactor with the outflow of the reactor flowing into the intake of a protein skimmer. Biopellets and solutions such as Nopox both do a great job at removing nitrate and phosphate, providing there's an efficient protein skimmer in place to remove all of that bacteria before it dies, in which case it would release the nitrate and phosphate back into the water column. If the protein skimmer isn't efficient enough to pull out all of the bacteria, or if you are overdosing a solution such as Nopox, you'll start to see greyish white slime build up in certain areas of the tank or sump. This is an accumulation of dead bacteria that wasn't pulled out by the skimmer before it passed away. If you're starting to see this slime build up, you need to reduce the dosing or buy a better skimmer. As to the choice between biopellets or a solution such as Nopox, I personally prefer solutions. Biopellet reactors tend to need a lot of cleaning, they can clog up easily and become less efficient, and they also take a month or so to kick in and start becoming effective. Whereas solutions like Nopox pretty much get to work within a few days. Keep in mind that solutions do need to be dosed daily, so a dosing unit would be a great way to achieve this. I should also mention that with carbon dosing, it generally removes more nitrate than phosphate. Now, it will remove phosphate, but there are variables that come into play as to how effective it will be, so quite often you might need a helping hand through other forms of phosphate removal. As to helping hands, this is probably a good time to talk about absorption as a form of removing nitrate and phosphate. One of the more popular ways of removing phosphate from a reef tank is through the use of GFO, granular ferric oxide. Ferric oxide is sold as small granules that absorb and bind up phosphate. It is ideally placed into a reactor with gentle flow so that the granules can tumble and utilise all of their surface area to do their job. Ferric oxide can also simply be placed into a netted bag or stocking and thrown into a section of the aquarium with moderate flow. However, it won't be as efficient if it's not actually tumbling in a reactor and can often compact and kind of form into a solid brick. GFO does a great job at removing phosphate from the water column. However, it is quite expensive. There are various brands on the market, the most popular probably being Roaphos, Phosban and Aquaforest. Another form of absorption is through resin. There are various phosphate removing resins on the market, as well as dedicated resins for removing nitrate and unwanted organics. One brand that's become quite popular over the last few months is called Blue Life. Their resins have become popular because they are regenerable, meaning that once they've used up all of their absorption capability, you can then remove the resins from your system, place them into a solution of diluted crystals, which they call Regen FX, and then release all of the bound up nitrate, phosphate, etc., and use them again. Blue Life claims that you can regenerate the resin up to 6 or 7 times before it loses efficiency. I haven't had the chance to test them myself yet, but they're definitely worth looking into as they look to be a more cost-effective option to other forms of absorption on the market. Now, last but far from least, I want to talk about algae as a form of removing nitrate and phosphate. As mentioned earlier, algae absolutely loves munching on nitrate and phosphate, and utilising various types of algae as a form of removing these nutrients can be a great option. Now, there are various ways of doing this. One is through what we refer to as a refugium, which is a sealed off section of your sump that is lit up by light and houses various types of macroalgae. We refer to it as a refugium because it also provides refuse for cute little creatures such as copepods, etc., which are highly desirable to the reefer. There are numerous types of algae that we can place into a refugium, but one of the more popular and easy to obtain types is called chaetomorpha, or chaeto. Another way of propagating algae to remove nitrate and phosphate is through what we refer to as an algae scrubber. An algae scrubber works by setting up a thin screen or multiple screens that are lit up with a thin layer of water trickling over them. Algae will grow and accumulate on the screens, which is simply scrubbed off on a regular basis, allowing the underlying algae its chance to grow before it dies from the lack of light. Refugiums also need to be pruned regularly for the same reason. If underlying layers of algae get stripped of light and die, they will release all of the nitrate and phosphate back into the water column. Algae is easily my favourite form of nitrate and phosphate removal because you also get a lot of extra added benefits. It can also remove heavy metals, pollutants, and can be handy competition to problematic algae that may be growing in the main tank. Another great benefit of algae is that when it is utilising light, it is photosynthesising and producing oxygen, which is essential to all of our fish and invertebrates. Aerobic bacteria, on the other hand, such as the bacteria fueled by carbon dosing, is utilising oxygen and stripping it from the water column. However, although algae is producing oxygen when it's photosynthesising, when the lights go out, it will start to utilise and deplete oxygen through respiration, as will coral. Now, this is of importance to reef keepers because when oxygen starts coming down, carbon dioxide starts going up and pH starts to drop. So typically in a reef tank through the night and day cycle, we're dealing with swings in oxygen, CO2 and pH. The lights come on in the morning, the coral starts photosynthesizing, the oxygen levels start going up, the CO2 levels start dropping and the pH levels start going up. In turn, when the lights go off at night, the coral stops photosynthesizing, it starts to utilize oxygen, the oxygen levels come down, the CO2 goes up and the pH drops. On a natural shallow reef, oxygen levels are pretty much at saturation point through the day, but can also swing at night when the coral and algae stops photosynthesizing. However, in a closed system such as an aquarium, we have the potential for way larger swings, which we're trying to avoid. A great way to counter such large swings when utilising a refugium or algae scrubber is to run them in what we refer to as a reverse cycle. This means that when the lights go off in the main tank and the coral stops photosynthesizing, we turn the lights on over the refugium or the algae scrubber so that the algae can start photosynthesizing. When the morning comes around, vice versa. With the right size refugium or algae scrubber, you can greatly reduce the swings in oxygen, CO2 and pH. So let's talk about sizing when it comes to refugiums and algae scrubbers. Now, if you were looking to deal with all of your nitrate and phosphate through the use of algae, you're going to need a large refugium or algae scrubber. Now, unless you've built the tank from the ground up with this in mind, most of you won't have sufficient space to deal with all of your nutrients through algae. However, adding the largest refugium or algae scrubber that you can to your system is still going to give you a lot of benefits. In recent years, we've started to see algae reactors come onto the market. These reactors are designed to house algae with a light through a centre shaft down the middle of the reactor. They can be placed into a sump or even externally outside the sump, and are a good option for those that don't have much real estate. Alrighty, so that pretty much covers most of the options that I'd recommend for removing nitrate and phosphate. Hopefully that's given you some food for thought. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're just starting up, but plan on bringing you a lot more videos in the future. Feel free to hit us up on Facebook, Instagram or YouTube with any questions whatsoever, or simply pop into the shop if you're local in Melbourne. Enjoy your reef keeping peoples. Over and out.